the end didn't come quietly. It came in chaos, betrayal, and a moment that would shock the entire world. A man who once ruled Italy with absolute power, reduced to a fugitive, hiding in plain sight. But what happened next was something no one expected. Because this isn't just the story of Benito Mussolini's fall. It's the story of how power can collapse overnight and how the people you once controlled can become the ones demanding justice. And here's the part most people don't realize. Mussolini didn't think he would lose. Welcome back to X History, where we uncover the darkest, most shocking truths buried deep in real history stories that feel unreal, but actually happened. Today, we're diving into the final days of one of the most controversial leaders of the 20th century, and the moment the world watched his rule come to a brutal end. But before we get into it, if you're into real history that feels like a movie, hit subscribe and stay with us because this story only gets more intense from here. Because to understand Mussolini's ending, you need to understand how high he once stood. In the early 1920s, Mussolini wasn't just a politician. He was a symbol of strength for a country in chaos. Italy was struggling after World War I, economic problems, political instability, fear everywhere. And then came Mussolini, promising order, power, and national pride. And people believed him. But that belief came with a cost. He built a dictatorship step by step, controlling the press, silencing opposition, and turning Italy into a fascist state. At first, many Italians supported him. But beneath that support, something dangerous was growing. Because power like this doesn't stay stable forever. It starts to crack. And the biggest turning point, his alliance with Adolf Hitler. At first, Mussolini didn't fully trust Hitler. But over time, he aligned himself with Nazi Germany, pulling Italy into World War II. It was a decision that would change everything, and not in the way he expected. Because instead of strength, it brought disaster. Italy's military struggled, resources ran low, cities were bombed, and slowly, the Italian people began to lose faith in the man who once promised them greatness. But here's where things take a turn most people don't expect. In 1943, Mussolini was actually removed from power not by the enemy, but by his own government. Think about that for a second. The same system he built turned against him. He was arrested, isolated, and it seemed like his story was over. But then, something surprising happened. Hitler refused to let him go. In a dramatic rescue mission, German forces freed Mussolini and placed him back in power, but not as the leader he once was. This time, he was more like a puppet, controlling a small Nazi-backed state in northern Italy. And this version of Mussolini, it was very different. Gone was the confident dictator, replaced by a man trying to hold on to power that was already slipping away. Because by 1945, everything was collapsing. The Allies were advancing. Nazi Germany was falling. And in Italy, resistance fighters known as partisans were rising up, determined to take back control of their country. And Mussolini knew it. He knew the end was close. But what he did next is something that still confuses historians today. Instead of surrendering, he tried to escape, not with an army, not with a plan for comeback. Just escape, disguised and desperate, Mussolini attempted to flee Italy, hoping to reach safety before everything fell apart. But this wasn't the powerful leader people once feared. This was a man running out of time. And here's the twist. He wasn't alone. With him was Clara Petacci, a woman deeply loyal to him, who chose to stay by his side even in his final moments. Their relationship adds a strange, almost human layer to this story. Because in the middle of political collapse, there was still personal loyalty. But loyalty wouldn't save them, because as they moved north, trying to blend in and avoid detection, something went wrong. Very wrong. They were recognized, captured by Italian partisans who had been searching for him. And in that moment, everything changed. This wasn't just an arrest. This was the end of an era. But what happened after his capture is where the story becomes even more intense and far more controversial than most people realize. Because the question wasn't just what to do with Mussolini. It was how to send a message to the entire world. And the decision they made would become one of the most talked about moments in modern history. But the real shock, it wasn't just his death. It was what happened after. Captured, exhausted, and completely powerless, Mussolini now faced something he had avoided for decades: judgment. But this wouldn't be a courtroom, and there would be no long trial. The war was ending, emotions were running high, and the people who captured him had already made up their minds. Or had they? Because even among the partisans, there was hesitation. Some wanted a formal trial, a chance to expose everything publicly. Others believed that delaying justice would only create chaos. Or worse, give his supporters time to react. And right in the middle of this tension, Mussolini waited. Witnesses later described him as unusually quiet. Not the loud, commanding speaker people remembered, but a man who seemed to understand exactly how this would end. It's a chilling contrast, and it raises a question historians still debate. Did he finally accept his fate? But here's where the story takes a sharper turn. On April 28, 1945, Mussolini and Clara Petacci were taken to a small village called Giulino di Mezzegra. It wasn't a courtroom. It wasn't even a formal execution site. Just a quiet location, about to become part of history. And what happened there still sparks controversy today. A partisan command arrived with orders. Clear, direct, and final. Mussolini was to be executed immediately. No speeches, no negotiations, no second chances. But in that moment, something unexpected happened. Accounts suggest there was a brief pause, a hesitation, as if time itself slowed down for just a second. And then, it was over. Mussolini was executed alongside Clara Petacci, who reportedly refused to leave his side even at the very end. That detail alone adds a strange emotional layer to the story, because in the middle of political collapse and violence, there was still a human connection that refused to break. But the story doesn't end here. Not even close, because what happened next is what shocked the world. After the execution, their bodies were transported to Milan, and this wasn't done quietly. This was deliberate, public, symbolic. Because the people of Italy didn't just want justice, they wanted to see it. In Piazza Loreto, a place already tied to earlier wartime violence, the bodies were displayed publicly. Crowds began to gather, not hundreds, thousands, and what followed was something raw, emotional, and deeply unsettling. Years of anger, fear, and suffering came pouring out in one place. For many Italians, this wasn't just about Mussolini, it was about everything they had endured under his rule and during the war. But here's the part that still divides opinion. Was this justice or something else? Because while some saw it as the final collapse of a dictatorship, others viewed it as a moment where control was completely lost. A powerful symbol, yes, but also a chaotic one. And this is where history becomes complicated, because it forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What happens when a leader who controlled everything suddenly has no control at all? What happens when the people decide to take power back? All at once, the images from that day spread quickly, across Europe, across the world, and they sent a clear message: this is how it ends. But was that message meant as a warning, or as closure? Even today, historians don't fully agree. Some argue that it prevented any possibility of Mussolini becoming a symbol for future movements. Others believe a formal trial could have revealed more answers, accountability, a deeper understanding of how it all happened. And that's the tension at the center of this story. Because Mussolini's death wasn't just the end of a man. It was the end of an entire era of control, propaganda, and absolute power in Italy. But here's something most people overlook. Even after everything, the impact didn't disappear overnight. Italy still had to rebuild. Politically, socially, emotionally. The scars of fascism didn't just fade away, they stayed, shaping the country's future in ways that are still visible today. And Mussolini himself? He went from being one of the most powerful men in Europe to a symbol of how quickly power can collapse when reality catches up. But the final piece of this story, the part that truly defines how the world remembers this moment, is not just what happened, but why it still matters. Because the real lesson isn't just in the ending, it's in everything that led to it. History doesn't remember Mussolini's final moments just because of how they ended. It remembers them because of what they revealed about power, collapse, and human behavior when control disappears. Because when you strip away the speeches, the uniforms, the propaganda, what's left? A man who once believed he was untouchable, brought down not just by enemies, but by the consequences of his own decisions. And that's where this story becomes more than history. It becomes a warning, because Mussolini didn't rise by accident. He understood people. He understood fear. He understood how to turn uncertainty into support. And for years, it worked. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The same public that helped build his power also watched it fall. And that shift didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly. Then all at once. At first, people supported him because he promised stability. Then they tolerated him because opposing him felt dangerous. And eventually, they turned against him when the cost became too high. And that pattern, you can find it again and again throughout history, which raises a bigger question. Was Mussolini the cause of everything or a product of his time? Because focusing only on him misses the larger picture. Italy after World War I was unstable, divided, and searching for direction. Mussolini stepped into that gap and gave people something to believe in. But belief, when mixed with control and unchecked authority, can become something else entirely. And that's where things started to go wrong. Because power without limits doesn't just change a country, it changes the person holding it. Over time, decisions become more extreme. Opposition becomes something to eliminate, not debate. And reality itself starts to bend around the leader's narrative. Until one day, reality pushes back. And when it does, it doesn't do it gently. By 1945, Mussolini wasn't making bold decisions anymore. He was reacting, trying to hold together something that was already falling apart. And that's a key moment people often miss, because power doesn't always look dramatic at first. Sometimes it looks like denial. Sometimes it looks like hesitation. Sometimes it looks like a leader pretending everything is still under control, even when it clearly isn't. And Mussolini's attempt to escape, that wasn't just a physical escape, it was symbolic. A man who once stood in front of massive crowds, now trying to disappear among them. A leader who built his image on strength, now hiding from the consequences of that image. And that contrast is what makes this story so powerful. But here's something even deeper. Even after his death, Mussolini didn't just disappear from history. His legacy became something people argue about, study, and try to understand. Because understanding him means understanding how systems like his are built, and more importantly, how they fall. Some historians focus on his mistakes, military failures, political miscalculations, his alliance with Hitler. Others focus on the structure. He created a system designed to centralize power and remove opposition. But the truth, it's both. Because no leader operates in isolation. There are always supporters, institutions, circumstances, all playing a role. And when everything aligns in the wrong way, you get moments like this. Moments where history doesn't just change, it breaks. But let's go back to that final public display in Milan for a second. Not to focus on the shock value, but to understand the message behind it. Because whether people agree with it or not, it was meant to be seen. It was meant to say something loud and clear. This chapter is over. And in many ways, it worked. Because after that moment, there was no illusion left, no myth, no image of power. Just the reality of how it ended. But here's the twist. Ending something is one thing. Moving on from it is something else entirely. Italy didn't just wake up the next day as a completely new country. There were questions, difficult ones. How did this happen? Who was responsible? Could it happen again? And those questions didn't just disappear, they became part of Italy's identity moving forward. Because real history isn't clean. It's complicated. It's messy. And sometimes, it's uncomfortable. But that's exactly why it matters. Because when you look at stories like this, you start to see patterns, not exact repeats but echoes. You see how power is built. You see how it's maintained. And you see how it can fall apart faster than anyone expects. And maybe the most important part, you start to understand the role of people, not just leaders. Because history isn't just made by one person at the top. It's shaped by millions of decisions, actions, and reactions from everyone else. Which brings us back to that moment in 1945. The fall of Mussolini wasn't just the end of a dictator. It was the result of years of pressure, resistance, war, and change finally reaching a breaking point. And when that point came, there was no going back. So what can we take from all this? Not fear, not fascination with power, but awareness. Because the real lesson here isn't about one man. It's about understanding how quickly things can shift when power goes unchecked and when reality is ignored for too long. And that's why this story still matters today. Not because of the shock, not because of the controversy, but because of what it teaches us about leadership, responsibility, and the consequences of both. And maybe that's the final twist. Mussolini spent years controlling the narrative, but in the end, history told his story for him. If you want more deep, real, and powerful history like this, stories that go beyond the surface and show you what really happened, make sure you're subscribed to X History, because the past isn't just something we study, it's something we learn from. And the next story, it might be even more shocking than this one.